So in our last episode, we assembled all of our gear sets for our input shaft and pinion shaft. We also did our base pinion shaft shim adjustment so we can get a baseline. We also added for the current gasket that we'd like to use. So today what I'm going to do is I'm going to verify that dimension and see how close we are. I don't want to go ahead and assemble the input shaft, pinion shaft together, put it in, and rely on having to use a different size gasket just because of availabilities. I want to show you how we set this up using the VW-385 tool. Now, in the past, when I've done early transmissions, I've had a lot of questions about this tool not being in the shop manual, and that is because at the time the shop manual was produced, this tool did not exist. If you were using the factory manual, it's going to show you a tool P258, which is basically a dummy carrier assembly that was machined to accept a dial gauge, and then that dial gauge was used with a mandrel. You would zero it and then put it into the differential and measure it. We can still use that tool if we have it. I do not. I have never had that tool. I've always used this tool. So I want to show you the setup of it. I know a lot of you are familiar with this tool. It has been around for a long time now, but just to go over the major points, you've obviously got the bar. This is the VW-385 bar. Dial gauge is just a generic dial gauge. I'm using an AST brand. It is a metric dial gauge. You want to make sure it is that, since all of our dimensions are in metric. These are adapter hubs, and these will actually slide onto the shaft. You'll see that in just a minute when we slide them into the case. And what these do, these fit up against the bearings and allow us to put a little bit of preload on this shaft so it's firm and centered in the housing. You have a specialized tuning fork. This is the VW-385/30. This is an absolute must because this is what we set up our dimension with. And the dimension that we set up on here has no correlation between this point and this point. It is a combination factor because we're also using a contact disc that has a set of magnets on the front of the pinion, and it takes into account the thickness of this disc, takes into account the center line of the shaft. So this dimension, when we set it here on our actual micrometer portion, does not correlate to what you would actually measure right here. So to set this up, it's pretty straightforward. I've got my dial gauge set in the end with a preload. I'm running about a 2.5 millimeter preload. I have my feeler that's screwed in, and we can see that's moving my dial gauge as I press it. Our differential calculation on this one is 63.3 millimeters, so I've set that micrometer to 63.3. And then there's two magnets right here on the shaft. What we want to do is just bring those contact magnet points in and hold this hard up against, and then we're going to zero our dial gauge. So I just got that, so it's zeroed, and what this has done, this is at a 0 reading. It's going to give me a plus or minus for my depth. On this particular one, we're actually looking for a measurement that's going to be 0.2 millimeters too deep because that's how big our gasket is we're using, and we want it to be able to pull back. So that's the basic setup of the bar. Let's go ahead and get our gear set assembled. We'll put our gear set into the case first, and then we'll put the bar in, take some measurements, and see where we're at. So since we're doing dummy measurements first, or just pre-measuring, what I'm going to do is I've got my intermediate plate. We assembled new bearings into that last time. I have my assembled pinion shaft. So what I'm going to do now is bring my pinion shaft into the intermediate plate, put on our other part of our bearing, and assemble it. We do need to be torqued for this, but I'm not going to put anything else into the intermediate plate. No input shaft, no selectors. Then we can go ahead and mount this in the case. Drop the bearing on. I'm just going to heat it just like I did with the other side. What I'm going to do now is just drop on my thrust washer, my spacer, and my top hub, because we need to torque the pinion shaft down, so that means all of the bearings and gears are compressed and under load. But I don't need to assemble my gear, and since I'm going to have to pull all this apart again anyways, I don't want to have that gear in my way creating problems while I'm measuring. So right now I just have the shaft in there finger tight. As you can see, it spins nice and smooth, and I'm just going to slide that in so I have my pinion head sticking out. And then we'll use probably just a couple of 4 nuts or so, nuts and washers, to hold it in the case, and then I'll tighten it once it's in there. So because these studs are designed to be used with the end housing case, I've just used a 10mm nut as a spacer. It was just something quick and simple. Flat washer, and I'm going to torque these to 25 Newton meters. So I have my pinion shaft installed. I've tightened the nut on the back of the pinion shaft. I have a little tool that I've made that helps tighten that pinion shaft nut. The tightening torque on the pinion shaft stretch bolt is 110 to 120 Newton meters. So I usually go right in the middle, right around 115. I have torqued the intermediate plate onto the transmission case. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to take our little plate. This is part of our VW-385 tool. It has 4 magnets in it, and that's just going to stick right onto the pinion shaft. I do have my bearing shells in. I'm using my old ones. Doesn't matter if it's the old or the new ones. And what I have done first on my 385 tool is, on one side it is adjustable right here, so I've got my adapter mandrels on, and what I did is I just set this side in first and brought our measuring stick around till it was right in about the center of where the pinion shaft is going to hit. This side will tension up with this screw. This will move it up and down. When we put the side cover on, we'll torque this down with 4 nuts. Once the side cover is on, what I'm going to be doing is rotating our tool until our mandrel contacts the differential, or the pinion. And then we'll read our dial gauge on the other side of the transmission. And I got to be just careful how much load, because sometimes these drop off. If you do have problems with the magnet not sticking, I've used super glue as a temporary, and then you just pop it off once you're done, because we do want to make sure that we can rotate our tooling and not have that slip off. So I'm going to put the side cover on next. So I've got my tool in and I've tightened the side cover. What I want to do is, right on this end is my adjuster, and I want to screw that in, which will move that mandrel out till it's just firm, but firm enough so I can turn it slowly, but not so firm that I can't turn it. I don't want any side-to-side movement. Then I'm just going to bring our tool around. And what I'll do is I'll wind it over and then wind it back. Oop, and my plate fell off. Alright, so my disc had fallen off, and so I used a little bit of grease since my super glue was all dried up just to help it stick. So with the bar in and everything back on, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to rotate it off and then rotate it on, and I want to find that sweet spot, right where it hits and then starts to go back the other direction. Sweet spot there. I'd say So our gasket, I measured all three of our gaskets again. This one is the smallest. It measures 0.210. So in theory, if we do the math and I put this 0.210 gasket in with a certain amount of crush, it's going to come back and give us our zero reading at 63.3 millimeters. Now Porsche gives us a tolerance of plus minus 0.03. So what I can do is take the side cover off, actually install a gasket and torque it and see exactly we should be at zero at that point. Okay, so I'm going to slide on my gasket, clean and dry, and we're going to be pulling it apart anyways. And I have two other ones that are pretty much exactly the same if I accidentally destroy this one. Okay, I'm going to do one quick tuning fork check, make sure our dial gauge is still at zero. Okay, please. Yep, dial gauge is still at zero. Okay, so I'm going to bring my dial gauge back down into contact. So when I first looked at it without the gasket, we were reading plus 0.3 of a millimeter. So that means here's our zero mark here, our dial gauge was coming plus 0.3. That means the pinion was in deeper by 0.3 of a millimeter. I've added a 0.2 millimeter gasket and torqued it, and when we've tightened it, we've seen about 0.04 of a millimeter crush in the gasket, because we only realized about 0.16 to 0.17 of a millimeter in gasket. So we've got two things we could do. I could reduce the shim pack by 0.14 on the actual pinion, and then that would get us pretty close to this. Or if I had another gasket that would crush to 0.14 of a millimeter, I could use that. So since I don't have another gasket that's going to crush to that, I think what I'll do is reduce my shim pack. So we'll go from a 1.6 millimeter shim pack to a 1.55 shim pack and see where that lands us. So I've removed 0.14 from my existing shim pack, and I have now a shim pack size 1.46, and I'm going to see if that does any better. So I've changed my shim pack, and just putting everything back together. I have my gasket in, back plate is torqued, and ready to take another measurement. There we have it. It is right on. Perfect. So it's showing like 0.0025 of a millimeter off, so well within the standard of plus minus 0.03. Okay, so now as you can see, we had our gear sets in and out. Had to re-shim to be able to use the gasket that comes with the gasket set. Actually ended up being very close to what Porsche would have said it would have been. The actual calculated number was 1.4 millimeters was our shim pack size that Porsche said we should use based on law of averages. We ended up at 1.46 using starting off at a 0.2 millimeter gasket in the back. So what this shows you is you can't do it without this tool or the P285 tool to actually measure what you've got. Now, normally what I would have done when a transmission comes in is I would have taken these measurements before I even disassembled the transmission. Unfortunately, we did not have that opportunity as this one came to us disassembled. The other thing that I would have done is I would have measured the current gasket thickness that was in the transmission when it came in the first time. These give us really good clues as to where our pinion depth is and gives us a way better starting point. Since we had no idea where this one was, it was like starting from scratch. So you can see it takes a couple of times and now it is perfect. Pinion depth is exactly where it should be. So next steps with this one, I can pull the intermediate plate off once again. I'm going to leave that gasket in place, being very careful since we know it fits perfectly. I can now go ahead and install the input shaft onto the intermediate plate, assemble up the gear sets, put the selectors on, adjust the selectors, and we're ready to move forward with this part of the transmission rebuild. For the differential side of things, we still need to replace the ring gear, pull it off our old carrier because we know that carrier is dead. We did get a used one in. I still need to pull the bearings off of it, see if it's usable. But setting the pinion is only one half of the differential setup. We still need to do crown wheel carrier preloads and backlash settings, which is going to be involving another assembly, disassembly as required.